following program contains scenes of sexuality, violence, coarse language, and adult themes. Because it's awesome! Viewer discretion is advised. Welcome to Lady Bits episode 8, where I'm going to show you 10 things women were doing in video games in the 1990s, and try not to move much so this dog collar doesn't hit the microphone. Right, Glowy Box? The 90s were an era of contradictions. The Cold War ended just in time for the Persian Gulf War and the rise of Al-Qaeda to start. The economy was booming just in time for a coming economic crisis thanks to high public debt and the aging population. Fashion in the 1990s reflected those contradictions. The fashion of the rise of hip-hop, the goth and industrial trends, riot girl punk, and then there was grunge, where it was totally acceptable to wear mustard-stained clothing in public. And of course, there were the Spice Girls and their contributions to third-wave feminism. Yes, in the 1990s, the Spice Girls were the face of mainstream third-wave feminism. No, really! This was the third wave feminism I came up in. Sexual violence and sexual harassment were the major concerns of the early third wave. Anita Hill brought sexual harassment into the popular lexicon in 1991. 18-year-old Desiree Washington became the villain in her own story in 1992 after Mike Tyson was convicted of raping her. Then, the O.J. Simpson saga began in 1994, pushing domestic violence back into the media spotlight. The 1990s were also the era of HIV/AIDS, so getting raped was no longer just shameful. It could result in getting a disease that would likely kill you. The teens and young adults of the 1990s were the first generation to be born into a feminist consciousness, but there was still a lot of progress to be made, and gaming was on the cutting edge of that progress. While the fashion world was embracing the ghoulish trend of heroin chic and re-embracing the waif, gamers were falling in love with a very different kind of woman. I already did an entire show on Lara Croft, but I'd be remiss if I left her off this list. For many gamers, Lara was the woman in gaming in the late 1990s. Tough, ruthless, dynamic, sexy, and better at everything than every man in her orbit, Lara was the anti-hero gaming needed and deserved. She was the personification of the three-dimensional graphics she helped usher in, including her personality. She embodied the best parts of early third-wave feminism, a desire to stop being afraid and to be seen, heard, and acknowledged. And she had strong personal boundaries.
Don't you think you've seen enough?
In the late 1990s, you didn't hear male gamers protesting that they didn't want to play as a girl, because Lara wasn't just a girl. She was Lara freaking Croft. The opening moments of the original Tomb Raider established Lara as someone you do not want to mess with, and male and female players alike loved her. She was so popular that Sony negotiated to make future Tomb Raider games exclusive to the PlayStation, which is credited as a major factor in making the PlayStation the dominant console of the fifth video game console generation. Tomb Raider also defined the template for all future 3D action-adventure games, including complex environmental interactions and action movie-style plots. Unlike her much more cartoonish contemporaries like Crash Bandicoot and Super Mario 64, Lara's story had a sense of gravitas and maturity. 1996 was also the year another major female character was introduced to gaming, and that character took the lead in a game that also defined a genre.
What is it?
Blood. Hope this is not Chris's blood.
This line became a meme precisely because Jill Valentine and Chris Redfield were the two playable character options in the original Resident Evil, but Almost everyone preferred Jill because she starts the game with a gun instead of just a knife, and she has more item slots in her inventory. So can we just stop this dumb myth that male gamers won't play as female characters? The 1990s called, they want their facts back. Resident Evil was the night of the living dead for Generation X, in that it completely terrified an entire generation who had never seen anything like it before. It's still seen as one of the greatest video games ever made for its innovations in sound design and cinematics. Named Biohazard in Japan, Resident Evil was the first game to be officially labeled survival horror, despite the fact that it was actually a remake of the 1989 RPG Sweet Home. Previous horror games like Alone in the Dark were cartoony and had minimal sounds, where Resident Evil featured a mansion that creaked and groaned, footsteps that echoed, and enemies that, right from the beginning, needed more than one hit to defeat. And of course, there was all that gore. All this combined when I was 17 years old to make this scene one of the most inexplicably terrifying things I had ever seen. Ooh, still creepy. Resident Evil was a phenomenon on the PlayStation. The idea of creeping doom and limited resources spoke to a generation that was being told everything was great. But we didn't see much proof. In 1999, Silent Hill built on what Resident Evil had established, moving away from B-movie tropes into the realm of psychological horror. While Silent Hill is objectively a much scarier franchise, much of Resident Evil's popular appeal is that it's so goofy that you almost learn to love the jump scares. Emphasis on almost. I hate jump scares. Like I hate The Sims. I hate The Sims. The survival horror genre has given us some of the most memorable visuals and characters in all of gaming, and none of that would have been possible without Jill Valentine exploring a creepy mansion looking for her teammate Chris before being betrayed by the evil and highly annoying Albert Wesker. Jill's influence extended to the Resident Evil films, which, you might notice, have a female protagonist. The 1990s were an era of these sorts of tough women in gaming, and perhaps there's no clearer example than the next entry on our list. Ocarina of Time is, for many gamers, the best Legend of Zelda game ever made. Some even say it was one of the best video games ever made. You're gonna keep hearing that a lot on this list. It was the first Zelda game to feature 3D graphics and gave top PlayStation titles a run for their money in terms of sales when it debuted in 1998. Ocarina of Time ended a 5-year hiatus in the release of Zelda games and introduced elements like target locks and context-sensitive controls that we take for granted today. Ocarina of Time was also the first game to feature Epona, Link's horse. But for the purposes of this show, the most stunning evolution in the Zelda series was the depiction of Princess Zelda herself. Ocarina of Time showcases Zelda's cunning, intelligence, and power in a far more direct way than any past game. After evading capture by Ganondorf, she disguises herself as Sheik, a character with ninja abilities that everyone believes to be male. Sheik helps Link do pretty much everything really important, and Sheik has gone on to become an extremely popular alternate version of Zelda, appearing in both the Smash Bros. And Hyrule Warriors franchises. Long before the outrage started demanding strong women, Nintendo reimagined Princess Zelda in a way that showed how brains can overcome brawn. But the pivot to Sheik also reflected the changing tastes of gamers in the 1990s towards female characters who were playable parts of the games. Even Princess Peach was taking a more active role in Mario games, available as a playable character in 1992's Super Mario Kart and 1998's Mario Party. In short, we wanted girls to kick ass alongside the boys. But a year earlier, a game came out that outdid Sheik on that point. Final Fantasy VII was the second best-selling game on the original PlayStation, outdone only by racing game Gran Turismo. It's the most beloved Final Fantasy game ever, and it introduced some of the most enduring female characters in the franchise. Tifa Lockhart, Eric Gainsborough, and Yuffie Kisaragi are all great characters in their own rights. but the way they work together in the game is what made Final Fantasy VII truly special. Tifa's shy and nurturing nature is a unique contrast to her hand-to-hand combat skills. Aerith initially appears carefree, which belies her true nature as the last of her kind with a profound destiny. Yuffie, meanwhile, is a tomboy thief whose personality is as oversized as her shuriken. In Final Fantasy VII, no single woman had to be a representative for the entire female gender. The game had enough female characters to allow them to be individuals. The spectrum of female experience that Final Fantasy VII achieves is truly outstanding, even by today's standards. Women in the game are funny, alluring, nurturing, loyal, defiant, sneaky, and steadfast. They commit acts of extreme sacrifice and selfishness, love and hate, and display varying levels of trustworthiness. In short, the women in Final Fantasy VII are individuals. Yes, there have been some complaints about their outfits, but that's short-sighted. If you're judging an incredible female character solely by their clothes, you're missing the point. The reason the love for these characters has endured is because they're not cliches. Perhaps it's not surprising that the planet in the game has been retroactively named Gaia, because Final Fantasy VII, from its strong female characters to its decidedly female-friendly villain, Sephiroth, had a decidedly girl power slant. While we're on the subject of villains,
I am Shodan.
the sentient, hyper-optimized data access network, or Shodan AI, has inspired gaming villains ranging from Atlas in BioShock to GLaDOS in Portal. Shodan was a nightmarish reimagining of the ship's computer from Star Trek if that ship's computer hated everyone and wanted them to die. This truly terrifying villain combined a decidedly artificial voice with a very human capacity for megalomania, callousness, and contempt back in 1994's System Shock and the 1999 sequel, System Shock 2. It seems that the developers who work on Shodan just can't quit her. System Shock developer Warren Spector and System Shock 2 developer Ken Levine both produced spiritual sequels to their respective games. System Shock set the baseline for story-based action games. Without this franchise, we may not have ever had franchises like Metal Gear Solid or Half-Life. Shodan also showed that the villain could be the centerpiece of a game, leaving the playable character to be little more than a window into the game world, allowing for maximum player freedom. Shodan set the groundwork for how a strong villain can create an emotional buy-in for a player, encouraging them to solve in-game challenges creatively. The relatively small amount of screen time Shodan receives allows the primary narrative to get out of the way and let the player play. But she packs such a huge punch in the time that she has that you don't quite ever forget about her, allowing the in-game experience to maintain an element of cohesion. This technique is used in other games that don't count as direct spiritual sequels, most notably the Far Cry series, which similarly feature villains on the box art instead of the game's playable characters. The strength of Shodan as a character helps System Shock popularize emergent gameplay in video games, complex interactions of plot and character that emerge out of relatively simple gameplay mechanics, sometimes resulting in solutions to in-game problems that the developer didn't foresee. And Shodan's influence reaches beyond video games. She's the inspiration for the name of a search engine for devices connected to the internet. It's a rare fictional character that inspires someone so much that they decide to make her real. This is just one example of how the video game characters of the 1990s had a profound effect on the real world. Another strong reaction defined the antagonistic relationship between politicians in video games right up to the present day. Mortal Kombat began its development life as an adaptation of the 1992 Jean-Claude Van Damme film Universal Soldier. That licensing deal fell through, and the idea was adapted to become the ultimate kung fu movie mashup game. It's extremely important to recognize how much of Mortal Kombat was borrowed from pre-existing sources because of the political reactions to the game. Perpetually shirtless movie star character Johnny Cage remains as an in-game joke about the game's origins. Liu Kang is an homage to Bruce Lee. Goro is an homage to Ray Harryhausen's stop-motion effects. Raiden and Shang Tsung were inspired by characters from Big Trouble in Little China. Kano's laser eye came from Terminator 2. Add 2 warring ninjas, Scorpion and Sub-Zero, a lizard guy named Reptile, and all Mortal Kombat needed was a last-minute female addition to the all-male cast, Sonya Blade. It was a humble beginning to a game franchise that would go on to create some of the most immediately recognizable female characters in gaming. Mortal Kombat introduced a lot of fighting game elements that continue to be popular today. The juggling mechanic, which is performing combos to keep your opponent dangling helpless in the air, and special moves that didn't involve partial circles performed with the joystick. This innovation is the only reason the scars on my thumbs from years spent playing console fighting games aren't worse. Seriously, I bled for those games. But the signature of Mortal Kombat was the fatalities, special executions performed at the end of a match, which were a combination of victory dance and one final display of skill. Many of these fatalities were also borrowed from pre-existing movies. Sub-Zero's spine rip was inspired by Predator. Kano's heart rip was right out of Temple of Doom. But the over-the-top violence was considered not kid-friendly enough for the Super Nintendo console, and the home version censored quite a few of the fatalities. Despite this censorship and the fact that none of the images were terribly original, Senator Joe Lieberman became aware of Mortal Kombat and proceeded to lose his Liebershit. Lieberman falsely believed that video games were still primarily played by kids, when, in fact, the generation who grew up playing Atari games were well into our teens and young adulthood. The Sega Genesis, the console that provided the less censored version of Mortal Kombat and outsold the Nintendo version 5 copies to 1, was aimed at teenagers and college students, not kids. This government scrutiny led to the foundation of the ESRB, the game rating system still used today. Most retailers and arcades completely ignored the ESRB rating at first, and quite frankly, an M rating on a game just made it seem cooler when I was 15. I had the benefit of discovering the Mortal Kombat franchise in real time, not through a lens distorted by history and changing taste. They were some of my favorite games of the decade, and the 1990s also gave birth to another group of games that greatly influenced my view of the world: PC RPGs. As a maroon D&D nerd, the original Baldur's Gate, released in 1998, was my way back into the Forgotten Realms. And the fundamental truth that had stuck with me since I was 11 years old: women of the realms were equal in abilities to their male counterparts. Baldur's Gate was my introduction to isometric Western RPGs. I didn't know what I loved more: the detailed stories with larger-than-life male and female characters, or the enemies exploding in showers of body parts, a type of animation I eventually learned was called jibbing. I dove into the catalog of Baldur's Gate publisher Interplay and discovered a treasure trove of similar games, including the first 2 Fallout games, which also had custom-made characters that allowed me to play as male or female, and the utterly magical Planescape Torment, which had a male playable character, but also had really cool female characters, like party members Anna and Fall from Grace. These games offered a wealth of choices I hadn't experienced in other types of video games. It's possible that these games that came out when I was just entering young adulthood helped teach me how to make adult decisions. These games had such a powerful effect on me, they seemed so made for me, that it was a complete shock to me that the player base for those sorts of Western RPGs is overwhelmingly male. The Interplay RPGs didn't just deepen my love of video games. They made me an advocate for women playing, making, and talking about video games. Because video games were things I could play that showed women doing stuff, other than looking pretty and whining about guys, in a decade where the top-rated TV shows included Veronica's Closet, Friends, and Touched by an Angel. But what about the women who were working in video games as opposed to the characters on screen? Women were integral parts of some of the biggest game franchises of the decade. The next woman on this list even shares my love of RPGs. Artist Rieko Kodama, also credited as Phoenix Ri, is still working in video games as a producer for Sega. She started her career as an artist back in 1984 and worked on the Phantasy Star series, as well as one of my all-time favorite games, Altered Beast. But her best-known game is likely the 1991 killer app for the Sega Genesis, Sonic the Hedgehog. The Sega Genesis was the first true 16-bit console, meaning it had vastly superior graphics to the dominant console of the time, the 8-bit Nintendo Entertainment System. Everything about Sonic was designed to show the increased graphics power of the Genesis. The diagonal spikes showed the increased resolution. The blue-on-blue shading showed the increased tonal range in the colors. But most importantly, Sonic the Hedgehog was a blazing fast gameplay experience. Instead of running, jumping, and climbing ladders, Sonic blazed through levels like a roller coaster. And compared to Mario, Sonic was edgy in personality, which added to the Genesis's marketing as the system for older, more discerning gamers. Sonic the Hedgehog created the first viable competition for Nintendo since Nintendo brought gaming back from the 1980s North American console crash. Sonic's popularity also allowed Sega to stay alive as a game developer after it stopped making consoles at the end of the 1990s. And that's very important because without Sega's survival, we wouldn't have Bayonetta today. Rieko Kodama has been around long enough to see the industry grow. She notes that more girls are growing up with video games, so more women are choosing the gaming industry as a career. She also notes that there are more female gamers in Japan than in the US because the Japanese gaming industry produces more games that focus on traditionally female interests like cooking and fashion, a potentially unpopular view in some corners of gaming, which doesn't make it less true. Kodama-san herself, however, is a Dungeons & Dragons player and believes that girls who enjoy RPGs have a greater chance of wanting to work in the video game industry. She believes in making characters that both genders can relate to, since she sees the importance of attracting more women, and therefore more sales, to gaming. But she also acknowledges that the majority of gamers are still male. But what about women making Western games in the 1990s? Don't worry, got you covered. King's Quest VI was the first King's Quest game since King's Quest II to credit a designer whose last name wasn't Williams. Roberta Williams co-designed King's Quest VI with Jane Jensen, and the result was a romantic epic that many praise as the best game in the King's Quest series. King's Quest VI featured multiple endings, open-world game design, and a 3D graphic introduction movie, which was a big deal in 1992 when the game was released on a whopping 9 floppy disks. For the CD-ROM re-release the following year featuring Beauty and the Beast voice actor Robbie Benson, Jensen wrote the lyrics for the end credits song The Girl in the Tower. In the 1990s, it was not yet fashionable to bash the living crap out of that trope. Jane Jensen would have earned her spot on this list just for this, but she went on to develop her own adventure game franchise, the macabre urban fantasy, distinctly adult Gabriel Knight games. Gabriel Knight featured a multiracial cast and an Asian American female assistant, love interest, and eventual playable character, Grace Nakamura. The series, created by a woman and featuring women of color in prominent roles, is considered racist and sexist by some modern game critics. Are we surprised? The game's protagonist, Gabriel Knight, is a slacker and a chauvinist, but the game treats these characteristics as flaws, which get him into trouble and repeatedly alienate him from Grace. I contacted Jane Jensen for this program, and she said that Gabriel was meant to evolve, and he does evolve through the 3 games. If the series had continued, he would have evolved further. Grace leaving at the end of Gabriel Knight 3 was meant to be the crisis point in a longer arc. Part of his character arc, of his coming to grips with his fear of commitment, was to lose her and have to face himself and his responsibility for that, sort of hitting rock bottom before you can truly change. Jane Jensen showed that female game developers don't just create good female characters, they can also create complex male characters. Jensen says, I personally think gender is much more complicated than male-female. Male-female isn't a binary, it's a continuum, and you can be anywhere on that spectrum, or even on different places on the spectrum for different aspects of life. A writer should write from their gut, because they need to have complete empathy with and be in the heads of their characters. That may or may not match what the writer looks like on the outside. In fact, Jensen's current creative pursuit is male-male romance books under the pen name Eli Easton. Eli Easton has written over 20 books since 2013. Despite her success in novels, however, Jensen hopes to write for games again in the future. She says it just needs to be the right opportunity. But if a woman this accomplished holds the number 2 spot, what's number 1? Like the 1980s episode, this spot is reserved for a game series that appeals to female gamers and included a female developer. It also includes a female character so popular that Nicki Minaj wrote a song about her. I know you know the name ChunLi, the breakout female character of Street Fighter II: The World Warrior. You may not have heard of Yoko Shimomura, who composed Chun-Li's stage theme, as well as everyone else's stage theme. All but 3 pieces of music in Street Fighter II are composed by Shimomura-san, meaning she composed some of the greatest video game music ever. It's impossible to exaggerate the importance of Street Fighter II. It popularized the fighting game genre and led to a resurgence in the arcade gaming industry in 1991. It was the best-selling Capcom console game for over 20 years, eventually surpassed by Resident Evil 5 in 2013. But the character of Chun-Li is important in her own right. Chun-Li's runaway popularity paved the way for dozens of iconic female characters in fighting games, including Street Fighter favorites Cammy, Rainbow Mika, and Crimson Viper. Chun-Li is striking in all media because her appearance combines physical strength with feminine beauty, making her the non-hip-hop media savior of dat ass and thick thighs in the decade of the waif. But she also had a distinct backstory, seeking to avenge her father and protect the innocent, especially children, all while being an Interpol agent. After Street Fighter II, the fighting game genre exploded, with series like Mortal Kombat, Killer Instinct, Soul Calibur, Tekken, King of Fighters, Dead or Alive, Battle Arena Toshinden, and Virtua Fighter, all featuring their own prominent female characters. Every female video game character created in the 1990s likely owes a debt of gratitude to Chun-Li, who lightning kicked down barriers to inclusion for female characters in a gaming landscape with an increasingly male focus. So, there you have it, 10 things women in video games were doing in the 1990s. I couldn't choose a single image to represent this decade, so I made a collage of them, Tiger Beat magazine style. And now it's going under the shelf. Thanks for watching my second historical retrospective for video games. Like what you see? Donations are appreciated, and monthly Patreon backers get access to a special bonus episode. And of course, share this episode on your social media. Next episode, we'll move to the era that gave rise to the Xbox and the domination of first-person shooters. The aughts, or for people who don't do those fancy words, the 2000s. For now, go play some fighting games and enjoy their proud tradition of female inclusion. I'm Leanna Kersner. Thanks for letting me show you my lady bits.
sorry, but Gabriel is allowed. Oh, I mean, he's out.
Yoda plane.